The American Clearinghouse on Educational Facilities is pleased to host today's webinar. For those of you attending your first ACEF webinar, ACEF is the Educational Facilities Clearinghouse funded by the U.S. Department of Education, established to provide technical assistance, training, and resources to public early childhood schools, K-12 schools, and institutions of higher education. ACEF provides resources on facility planning, design, financing, construction, improvement, operation, and maintenance. If it is not your first time to join an ACEF webinar, welcome back. Before we start our session, I want to make mention of a few important details that will enhance your webinar experience. Please make note of the many interface options available on your SABA Centra screen. Participants may reply yes or no in response to the presenter, laugh, applaud, and step out. You may raise your hand for questions, but we would prefer you send your questions through text chat. The text chat button will allow you to send questions to the presenter throughout the presentation. The speaker has an allotted time later in the webinar to address questions that the audience may have. Thank you for joining us today. We hope that you take this opportunity to learn from the content presented, engage with the speaker, and add to your professional knowledge of issues related to educational facilities. We are excited to have Mr. Ben Harris joining us today for this webinar entitled Guidance for School Tornado Shelters. Ben Harris is a Director of Engineering with 15 years of experience in project management and architectural, structural, and civil engineering design for educational projects. Mr. Harris is a published author and frequent speaker on structural design. He is actively involved in industry organizations, leading the development of several national masonry building codes. Also as chair of the National TMS Disaster Investigation Program, he knows firsthand how buildings perform in extreme events. Welcome, Mr. Harris. Thank you for sharing your expertise with our audience today. During today's webinar, the ACEF staff will be assisting Mr. Harris and all participants.
Good morning, and my name is Ben Harris, and today we're going to talk about guidance for school tornado shelters. This is going to include discussion on existing facilities where you have to figure out where to put children, and also for new construction where you might be able to design a space specifically for tornado shelters, and also if you have existing spaces that you want to retrofit or remodel so that they can become safer, also called hardening. A lot of this presentation, you'll hear me refer to the guide for developing high-quality school emergency operations plans. As a structural engineer, I'm going to talk a lot about the building and the facilities as a structural engineer. But this guide gives you a lot of very valuable information and resources that you can refer to on developing any emergency operation plan. This was developed by a collaboration of many federal agencies, the U.S. Department of Education, Department of Health and Human Services, Department of Homeland Security, Department of Justice, the Federal Bureau of Investigation, and the Federal Emergency Management Agency, FEMA. But of all the things that can happen in a school, one of the natural hazards that we're going to talk about today is the tornado hazard. And that's a significant concern for schools. Unlike a hurricane, where a hurricane may occur and the children may not be in school because there's enough time that you are warned about the event, these children are generally not at school when there's a hurricane that hits. But with a tornado, these things happen with such little warning that this really is an emergency that we recommend that schools consider a plan for. Of the types of tornadoes, many of you may have heard the different classifications, EF0 all the way through EF5. The EF5 is the most severe classification. The classifications are not directly associated with specific wind speeds. Sometimes you hear them in the media correlated, and generally you could say a 250-mile-an-hour wind is associated with an EF5 tornado. But it's not like we designed specifically for an EF5 tornado when we do a tornado shelter. And you'll find that many of the events are lower in the EF scale, but they still occur and still qualify as tornadoes. If you want to look at your specific local history over the last 50 years, there's a very valuable resource that you can find from NOAA's website. It's listed at the bottom of this slide, noaa.gov. And you can select the dot on where you are in the country, and it'll pull up 50 years worth of data and color-code it. And you can see the scale on the left that shows the F0, which is the lowest scale, and the F5, which is the highest scale, are color-coded, blue and pink in this graphical presentation. And you can find your location and see how real is your local history. And that's valuable in your conversation with your community beyond, as well as the local municipal and state governments. In developing your emergency protocols, we recommend that you look at the steps that are in the process for planning, and they're in that high-quality school emergency operations plan guide. And item 1 is obviously to form a collaborative planning team. Number 2 is to understand the situation, in this case, the tornado threat, and all the things that can come from that situation. Determining goals and objectives, and then planning, developing a plan, identifying the courses of action that may be appropriate, and then plan preparation, review, and approval by all of the entities that may be appropriate for review, as well as at a very important step, which is implementation and maintenance, which is something that is easy to overlook, but when you're developing your plan, you need to think about what is the maintenance required for that plan. And these are appropriate with any emergency. Specifically, they also apply to tornadoes. FEMA has developed guidelines on the design of tornado shelters. One of them that is most significant in the conversation is FEMA P361, which is the Design and Construction Guidance for Community Safe Rooms. It was published in 2008. And FEMA has also prompted recent changes in the International Building Code regarding tornado shelters design standards. And so this is applicable if you're doing a new facility and you want to design a new shelter. That's the most applicable use of that document. Conversations should take place between the local schools and the local municipalities, as well as really at the state level, on what is the standard of care that's appropriate in your local school system for a tornado plan and for investing money into that plan, and that will probably include retrofitting existing buildings, or it could include building new structures that qualify as shelters. States and local municipalities may or may not choose to adopt the newer code provisions that were prompted by FEMA in the International Building Code. Where these are adopted and where applicable geographically, integrating an EF5 tornado shelter location in a new school will be a requirement. Where it's not required by local or state adoption, schools have the option to install shelters, and they should consider this option. Retrofitting, which is remodeling an existing building for normal changes of use, it's often very economical. If you want to change something from its classroom space into an administrative space, for example, very often you can retrofit or remodel to convert the use of that space. However, I do want to stress that retrofitting an existing building area to be a tornado safe room or a shelter is often very challenging. For tornado shelters, wind pressures are often 4 times greater than what you normally would design a building for. Roof loads are often 5 times greater for a tornado shelter, and can be even more if you have adjacent structures that could fall down and collapse on top of the tornado shelter. Therefore, constructing a new safe room or shelter is typically more economical than retrofitting an existing space. And those terms, safe room and shelter, are very specific terms that are used in industry standard documents with a very high bar associated with designing for an EF5 tornado. School systems can voluntarily harden any areas of new or existing buildings wherever it's not required to have a shelter. And that term, hardened, is not associated with a specific design standard. It's generally used when action is taken voluntarily to improve the structural strength of areas of a proposed or existing buildings. Structural concerns that we look at obviously are very high exterior and interior wind pressures. And quite often people will overlook the interior pressures that will occur. The interior pressures will occur primarily because of natural ventilation, which is typically used in ICC 500 shelters, and we'll talk about ICC 500 in a minute. But you can also have them for other reasons, where the exterior pressures will create interior wind pressures. We also have to consider debris impact, and there are test results that you have to prove any item that is a door, for example, will meet the testing standards for debris impact resistance. There are some universities and other testing labs that have a gun that can shoot a 2x4 of a certain length and weight at a certain velocity, and you have to pass the performance requirements under those debris impact testing standards. When considering any development of an emergency protocol, storm weather protocols should follow the recommendations of the Guide for Developing the High Quality School Emergency Operations Plans, which I referenced earlier. Integrating these plans with security lockdown procedures and training drills may be very appropriate if you can do that. Communicating these procedures with parents, as well as emergency responders, firemen, police, and with the community at large before an event occurs is often very appropriate. And wayfinding signage in the building is very helpful for those who may not be familiar with exactly where the boundaries of the shelter are. And so it may be helpful to have signage specifically to make sure that people know where they're supposed to go. Quite often this is a difficult thing to do with existing buildings. When sheltering is required because a tornado is present or a threat of a tornado is present and you're in the shelter, we think that it's appropriate, if possible, to compare the student and staff attendance count with the head count in the shelter and then investigate if you have different numbers. Obviously, we don't want to leave anyone outside of the shelter if someone did not get the signal or the notification or for some reason is having trouble getting into the shelter. This may not be possible at all shelters. Consider if it may be realistically possible to identify people who are permitted and are not permitted to enter a storm lockdown area. And this may be an area where you may not have your primary electrical power. And this is a very challenging thing to consider because the architecture of your space sometimes will prohibit this. And so if you're doing a new shelter, you have that flexibility. You would be able to communicate with people that may need to enter. Communicating may be through electronic means, or it may be through a glass that is a storm-rated glass and a very small one, such as a vision panel. Opening the door only for permitted people means that when you open that door, you are endangering everyone inside of the shelter. And so it's going to be a difficult situation if somebody walks up and it's clear that the tornado has hit. And so it's a very unpredictable situation, but it's one that we want to try to plan for and prepare for as much as possible. Obviously, after entry, you would want to re-secure the door. So one thing to consider may be an airlock vestibule where you have two storm-rated doors, two tornado doors, such that one person who's designated, if that person sees someone outside of the airlock, could then go into the airlock, secure the door behind them so that all of the occupants in the shelter are still protected, and then go into the precarious situation of opening that outer door to let one or more people into that vestibule and then shutting the doors. It's generally ideal to be able to maintain continuous visual supervision of students during storm lockdown. These are often times where you don't have a planned curriculum, and it would be preferable so that you can monitor their activities during the time that they're in the shelter. But this may not be realistically possible at all tornado shelters, depending on a number of factors, such as the architecture. The United States Department of Education Readiness and Emergency Management for Schools Technical Assistance Center has specific guidelines that many emergency considerations are available for those guidelines, such as restroom usage, and there are just many things that I'm not going to cover here as a structural engineer, but are very appropriate. And this is a great reference, a great resource that you can reference, rems.ed.gov. Consider if it may be reasonable to have one or maybe more doors opening inward. Now, this would allow for egress, for exiting the shelter after a tornado, because debris may potentially block off your egress if your door only opens outward. Now, this is something that is a detail, but it would need to be discussed with the local authority having jurisdiction very carefully, because it's important that you don't create a problem where you prevent people from leaving during a fire under normal situations when it's not a tornado shelter. So there are numerous ways that a shelter can be designed, and this is one of the many things to be considered. Under many situations, the ICC 500 document, which I'll refer to in a minute, does not require a door that opens inward, but I mention it because it's something that should be considered. Shelter protocols should also be developed at the discretion of the local education agency. Guidance on many of these considerations can be found for any emergency in that guide that I've referenced a couple of times, the Guide for Developing High-Quality School Emergency Operations Plans. Now, I'm going to talk about some changes that have happened in building codes over the last century. Wind speed language has changed several times in the last decades. Currently, wind pressures are essentially the same for different terminology. And an older version that some of you may have heard in passing as you've looked at plans and read what the notes on the plans say the building was designed for, or just in conversation and even listening to meteorological data from the news. The older method of measuring wind was called the fastest mile, and the older 70-mile-an-hour fastest wind is roughly associated with the same recent 90-mile-an-hour 3-second gust wind, which was used in a document called American Society of Civil Engineers 7 from 2005. However, recently that same committee of ASCE has changed those numbers by making it 120 miles an hour for what was essentially equivalent to 90 miles an hour wind pressures for design. And so this is very confusing for the lay person, because you're using what appears to be the same terminology, but you're meaning something very different. And so today I'll say that 120 miles an hour is what we designed for, with a 3-second gust wind measurement, and that's inconsistent with the most recently published version of ASCE 7, which is referenced by the building codes. Current building codes have more design requirements than they used to in order to resist net wind uplift, and they actually do not permit construction methods allowed by older codes in many cases. And so if you look broadly over the last century as buildings have been built, the standards today are much more stringent and require a much more robust structural design than they did as you go to any structure really in history. One of the documents that I've referenced a couple of times is the ICC 500. This is the national standard for design and construction of storm shelters. And this is what is referenced by the International Building Code. So many areas of the country fall in an area where the local authority having jurisdiction has adopted some form, some version of the IBC, International Building Code. The more recent versions of that document reference this standard so that if you are going to construct something and call it a shelter, it needs to comply with this standard. And this standard is based in large part on FEMA's document P361, which I referenced earlier. But this one, unlike FEMA's document, this is a minimum standard, a set of standards that's been published in 2008, which you have to comply with if you're going to call something a shelter. So if you look at what has been proposed by FEMA and was accepted, the new language is before you on this slide. It was added into the 2015 version of the International Building Code, and this was prompted by FEMA. Now, keep in mind that each state and each local authority having jurisdiction has the choice to adopt this as it is before you here, or they can amend it by changing something. They could change the wind speed, for example, if they wanted. They can change anything they want, and they actually could simply just not adopt this language at all. So it's up to the state and local authority having jurisdiction. And what you'll see is that for Group E, which is the educational occupancies, in areas where the shelter design wind speed for tornadoes is 250 miles an hour, and that's from a figure that I'm going to show you in the next slide, where that is 250 miles an hour in that figure, which is about a third of the country. All Group E occupancies for new construction with an aggregate occupant load of 50 people or more, so that could be, for example, a 2-classroom addition to an existing building, shall have a storm shelter constructed in accordance with ICC 500. The shelter shall be capable of housing the total occupant load of the Group E occupancy. And so it's important to understand that the design interpretations of this will be developed as this becomes implemented across the country. However, the change I want to highlight for you is that this does not say if you design something and call it a shelter, comply with ICC 500. This says you would have to build a shelter that complies with ICC 500. Shall, very different language. This is that map. And in the center, roughly a third of the United States, you'll see a very dark region, the darkest region. And that's where, if you're going to design a shelter by ICC 500, you would have to design it for 250 miles an hour winds. And so where the local authority adopts the 2015 version of the IBC in upcoming years, if you're located within that darkest region, you would be required to have a tornado shelter in your facility if the local facility, a local authority having jurisdiction adopts the 2015 as is and does not amend it. So that's a significant change. A common question is, will the IBC change affect my school if the ICC zone for 250 miles, if it's in the ICC 500 zone for 250 miles an hour wind speed? And the answer is yes. If the building code is adopted, the 2015 version of the building code is adopted by your city or state, but we don't know when that will be. That depends on your city or state. It could be 2016, it could be 2017. They may never choose to adopt the 2015 IBC. One example to be aware of is some states, like in Texas, there's a Texas Education Agency Commissioner's rules. They refer to the most recently published version of the IBC if there is no other locally adopted building code. And so that means that this will take effect much sooner than it would for other jurisdictions where they have a building code adopted and they simply have to update it to another one. Another common question is, who's going to pay for the construction required to meet this code? And this is a very important issue, and it should be discussed at the state or local decision-making level. Unless state or local funding is made available, costs incurred to meet these code requirements would be paid like any other type of new construction. Therefore, a school should take this into consideration when planning for future educational facility construction. Some states have made funding available, and as we said, this should be a dialogue between all the different levels of decision making. When evaluating the relative safety of different areas in existing schools that you have already in your inventory, you have a real challenge. And so I'll say, beginning, evaluating that can be extremely difficult in the absence of any tornado room, safe room, or a shelter that's already been identified. And that's, frankly, the case in many buildings across the country. So to take into consideration structural differences between structural systems, a structural engineer can be consulted. A structural engineer is a type of professional engineer, and we recommend that you would get a licensed structural engineer that's licensed in your state if you're going to talk with them. And they can look at the differences between construction. For example, older construction may or may not be safer than newer construction. While code standards have increased with time, that doesn't mean that somebody in the past went well above and beyond what was the code minimum of standard. Some types of construction are more redundant inherently than other types of construction. So a structural engineer can help you evaluate those structural differences. If you were to contact someone at the fire department, they may not be a licensed structural engineer that could evaluate those from a structural perspective. Providing access to existing construction documents will aid the structural engineer or anyone with the process of trying to evaluate the relative safety of different areas, and may prove more meaningful for the school. And I'll also refer to you to FEMA P361 Appendix B.1 for guidance with this discussion, because they have some good guidance there. Some important ICC 500 tornado shelter requirements to consider are these 6 items. These are not all of the things you need to do. These are not all of the important things to do. I've tried to highlight some of the things that can be concerns when you are conceptually considering your options. And so these alone may help you guide yourself through the discussion of what is a feasible shelter, or is it feasible to retrofit an existing shelter, for example. So to be clear, ICC 500 requires the following if an area is to be designated as a tornado shelter in accordance with that ICC 500 standard, and there are no other amendments that locally have been made which would change the ICC 500 standard. So that standard would require you design for the specific wind speed according to that map I showed, depending on your geographic location. The roof live load would need to be 100 pounds per square foot. Normally for a building that's 20 pounds per square foot. In northern portions of the country, you have higher snow loads than in southern portions of the country. And so this may be less of an impact than for southern areas of the country where normally it's simply 20 pounds per square foot. Debris impact testing and baffling, which is a way of diverting the debris, is required at all openings. So for example, if I want to have a door, I have to have a door that has been tested, not by calculation proven, but by testing proven to be successfully able to resist that 2x4 impact testing. If I have a rooftop unit on top of my roof, and I have ducts that come through the roof system, if that rooftop unit is something which will likely be sucked off during a tornado or blown off, then I have an opening that needs to be baffled. And so I can divert the debris by creating a manifold, a shroud around the ductwork that is strong enough, also has been tested to be debris resistant, that follows the duct line far enough so that any debris coming into that opening would not hit the occupants below. There are some products on the market that claim to be qualified as compliant with the ICC 500 for debris impact testing. I would caution you to look closely at those products, because as we've investigated those ourselves, we found that the claims are not actually always what you might think. So you need to dig into this. I'm sure with time this will improve as more products are tested by independent universities or other testing labs, and we have more of a product availability that's more to what we want in our buildings. You would need to have a minimum 5 square feet of usable floor space per person. That does not include your desks, for example. And so there are ratios in the standard on how you would discount the areas that are going to be occupied by furniture. But in general, you want 5 square feet. And that's a minimum, because if you have someone who is handicapped, for example, you would need to have 10 square feet, and other considerations would need to be made for floor space. But I am mentioning it, and this is one of the most critical things to consider, which is what is the necessary area to assign as your shelter space? Or if you're going to even do it a hardened space, you could use that as a guideline to consider. But if you consider a normal ceiling tile that's 2 foot by 2 foot, that's 4 square feet. And so you can imagine if you're in a building where everybody's standing underneath a ceiling tile, that's packing people in pretty tight, pretty close. So you have to think about the human element of what it's like to be in that environment and manage that in your plan. You would need to have at least 2 single-person restrooms in most school shelters. You might have to have more depending on the number of occupants. For example, I believe if you have to have greater than 1,000 people, then you would have to have 3. And then you might have to have even more depending on how much more than 1,000 you have. In some instances, ICC 500 requires that one door that swings inward, which is an emergency escape opening, which I referred to. But I would like to note that it does not require that in all shelters. I've got some slides here that show a prototype that could be considered for a classroom as a shelter. And this would be compliant with ICC 500. And what you'll see is where I've got the blue line that follows all the way around this classroom wing, that would be your perimeter. And ICF, insulating concrete formwork, is one type of a system that could be used to create something like a 6-inch solid concrete core, and it would also give you the benefit of having the insulation. There are other types that are acceptable. You could use concrete masonry. You could use precast concrete tilt wall panels. You can use other types such as steel plating with metal framing, steel framing that protects it all. There are residential shelters and there are community shelters. And the ICC 500 ICC 500 document that we're referencing is talking about community shelters, which is the appropriate shelter standard to be looking at when you're talking about a school shelter, not a residential type shelter. It's important to note that there have been some ICF failures of residential storm shelters that have been observed, and so there is some concern about the ability to see inside of the ICF. That could possibly be addressed by your quality assurance plan, and that is one of the requirements in the ICC 500, and part of that quality assurance plan for ICF could, for example, be thermal imaging cameras where you scan for voids that might be in that ICF wall. But generally speaking, commercial construction has a higher caliber of contractor than a residential contractor that may have, on that one situation where the debris hit through the insulation, there may have been a construction defect in that one residential shelter that was observed, for example. Across the entire roof of your classroom wing, you would need to have a substantial roof system. This would not just be a simple bar joist with metal deck. This would be steel beams likely, and metal deck, and then a concrete slab on top of that, a composite system where you connect the steel beams and the concrete slab. You could also do precast slab elements. There are some concerns about when debris hits a roof, would concrete fall and come off and come down into the room below? And if it did, what would be the threat to occupants? So what I'm showing here is some steel beams, and you can see the piping that would be necessary for ventilation or for other purposes, and all of those pipes would need to be baffled, and I'll talk about that in a minute. Tornado shelter prototype here would also have to consider the openings that you would have at doors and at windows. And in this prototype I'm showing here, we would address them with the same type of a system. And you can see in this picture the door system that is used as a shutter that would be physically shut over the door, over the window. And at a door, you would use the same kind of a shelter door. This has been tested, and you would need to get one that has been tested and also has been shown to have the pressure rating you need for the wind pressures that would occur at your particular facility. And these doors are not difficult to use, the ones that are available on the market today. You can buy one that is able to shut, and you don't have to physically bolt the top or bolt the bottom because it automatically does that. You can very easily open it with a turn of the handle and opening it. It's not a difficult door to shut and open because it's balanced. So you don't have to have a strong person to shut this shelter door. And I answer those questions that you may have in your mind because until you've actually seen one and felt it, you might be concerned with those items. But it essentially is just a door once you've got it in place. It's a very heavy door, but it's balanced and has the appropriate hinges and software and the hardware on it. I mentioned baffling of openings, such as rooftop units and piping. This picture shows you a diagram that you would have to map out what's the path that a 2x4 could take to get into your protected occupant area. And you would have to consider, do I have a maze where debris will not get into the space? And you have to consider the geometry of your baffled opening, as well as the material of your baffling. So if you have ductwork that comes down, you could make the ductwork itself the material of the baffling if you have debris testing that shows it's a thick enough material at the support spacing that you have to qualify. You also want to keep small openings in general to limit the size that debris could come through. You also have to have proper signage. The tornado shelter sign I'm showing you here would not be the large plaque that you would need to have at the two locations I'm showing you in blue on the sides. The large plaque has to have a lot of information that's dictated by the ICC 500 if ICC 500 is the standard you're following on what to put on that plaque. You would need to have for example, the manufacturer, the date it was installed, the type of shelter. Is it a tornado or a hurricane shelter, or is it a tornado and hurricane shelter? And list of the design wind speeds and other criteria. You may also want to have a floor plan on that plaque so that people in the future, as staff will change over in a building through the years, so that you have something that people can look at and study and know exactly where the boundaries of that shelter are. We're showing here a small room where you could have what we call, in our office, a command center. This is not something in the ICC 500, but it is an appropriate thing to consider because you may want to have one place where you would have, for example, a two-way radio, a form of communication where you can contact first responders, let them know that the shelter has been activated and everybody's in the shelter. You could communicate with the public from this center. And it doesn't have to be large. It can be also the spot where you have a battery backup for when the power shuts down. You'd be able to have automatic transfer to the battery backup so that your emergency lighting will still function, and so that things like if you have electromagnetic plating on the shelter doors to hold them propped open, you could have a button that you would push to release that plating so that the doors would shut. One of the things that's important to remember is if you do have a command center and it's locked, you need to be aware of who has that key, as well as who has the key to the shelter itself. We don't want to have, for example, a dedicated standalone shelter and everybody loses the key. So you've got to think about that because there have been people who have been killed outside of a shelter that was perfectly good, but it was locked. Tornado shelter prototypes that I'm showing you here should have consideration for handicap accessibility. And most facilities around the country have been working towards compliance fully with the American Disabilities Act for a long time. I will say one important twist that you should consider with shelters, which is that you may have a building that fully complies with ADA, but when you put a shelter in one location, you want to make sure that you have handicap access to the shelter from everywhere. So for example, if you have two buildings on a campus, each building itself may be compliant with ADA requirements. But if you put a shelter in between those two buildings, you want to make sure that both occupants of both buildings have an accessible route to get into the shelter, and preferably one that's not a long meandering route, but one directly into the shelter. Consideration of time is something I should mention. There is not a specific time requirement in ICC 500 for travel that you anticipate from one of the occupants of the building to get into the shelter. However, generally, a tornado happens very quickly. And so you may want to consider, is this something that would happen, would I be able to get there from here in 10 minutes, 5 minutes? 5 minutes is something that I hear quite often, and 10 minutes in some areas where they're really struggling to try to find a shelter solution that works. FEMA P361 also has a lot more guidance on the time that you should you should plan on requiring someone to get from one place to another. But I mention it on this slide because those who are handicapped may need more time, and that should be considered as well. A tornado shelter prototype here shows a restroom, and this would be a restroom bank that you might have in a regular classroom. It's important to note that the number of restroom facilities here are more than would be required by ICC 500 if you're following that standard for the minimum number of restrooms. However, you may want to do this because this is your classroom wing and you have a dual function for having those restrooms available. And so they also get maintained. There are examples of hardened gymnasiums that you could consider. For example, you could design for 160 mile an hour wind, which is generally associated with lower tornadoes, such as an EF2 tornado, instead of a 240 mile an hour area where you have like half the wind pressure, using thicker walls than you normally would for your regular 120 mile an hour design speed, for example, which is the majority of the center of the country that applies. Or you could have a thicker roof deck, maybe an 18 gauge roof deck when normally you'd use a 22 gauge. You could have closer roof joists to try to help you protect if there's large debris that would try to come through, such as a car, because most schools have cars all around them, and cars can get picked up in a tornado. And also they would consider impact-resistant doors and windows. In a gymnasium that's hardened, that may be a location that's central and easy to communicate to everyone, because you may not be able to have all the signs that say this is a shelter if you're not going to comply with the current requirements for a shelter. You certainly don't want to imply a higher level of safety than you're actually providing people. And so one of the benefits of referring to FEMA P361 and ICC 500 is when you call it a shelter that complies with those documents, you have a very high level of standard of care that you can tell people you meet, and with confidence say you know you meet that. But if you're hardening something just voluntarily, you don't want to imply that you have that level of safety. So the signage may just be saying it's a gymnasium, but everybody may know, hey, go to the gym, and everybody know what that is. It's also easy to maintain regular security because it's just a regular building space. And in a gymnasium, you'd have a nice wide open space where it would be easier to count heads and to visually supervise students during the time that they're in there. Some of the challenges of hardening an existing space is that you need to remember the gym is not necessarily the best shelter in a severe weather event unless it's designated as a safe room or shelter, or at least if it's hardened. So when you're hardening existing buildings, large spaces have different challenges from small spaces. It may cost more to upgrade the structural capacity of larger spaces because of the larger spans, not only for the roof spans, such as over a basketball court, but also the taller wall heights that have to span as wind pressures want to push on that wall, and it spans between the roof diaphragm and the foundation. And then the roof diaphragm transfers those loads into the shear walls on the sides. Small spaces, on the other hand, they can be hardened, but they may not have the operational features desired for security and supervision. There are so many factors to consider, but one of the benefits of a small space, if it's a classroom, is that you already have the children in that classroom. They don't have to move to a shelter. So there's just lots of things to consider. I've tried to cover a lot of those things here in this presentation, but I've also referenced some very good guides that are available, that have been made available by our government. In many cases, it's simply not easy to obtain a higher level of safety for all of the building occupants. And I mention that because if you have 1,000 people in your high school, but you have a great shelter for 500 people, what do you do with the other 500 people? And so you need to consider the plans you have and consider what is available and how do you prioritize and organize things so that everybody knows the plan and that there isn't a panic at the last minute. So thank you very much for listening, and are there any questions? I see here a question that says, what qualifications should we look for when asking someone to review our storm weather protocols? It's a great question. I mentioned a little bit of this during the presentation. You can talk to first responders, your fire station, police station. It's important to talk with them because you're going to want them to know where you are so that if there is a tornado, they know exactly where to go. You also want to be able to communicate with them to tell them when you're in that position. But while you're doing that, you can also ask them their opinion, because as emergency responders, they have been educated on what happens. They have heard lots of stories. They know how they can extract people, and so their guidance is valuable. However, as I mentioned, I think that it would be good to have guidance from a structural engineer that's qualified to evaluate the different structural systems. You can go look at your local state professional engineering board, and you can look at their website, and you can find structural engineers that are in the discipline of structural engineering and are practicing in your local area. Or you can contact design professionals you normally work with and ask them for guidance to help you contact and select a good qualified structural engineer. Another question here is that I've heard FEMA pays for tornado shelters in schools, and is that true? FEMA has paid for some shelters through different avenues. For example, there have been some grants made available through FEMA where people have applied and they have paid for a % of the cost increase to go from a regular facility to a facility with a community shelter. Some of those are for community shelters that are intended for people beyond the school population, and that's providing a service to the community at large. So that's one consideration. Also, those funds are only available for so long because there's only so much money in the pot. There's only so much that FEMA as an agency is able to do, and so you have to consider that, and also the timing of your process in building a building with the timing of trying to apply and get a grant. So as we said before, that's why it's important to remember this is really something, when you come to funding, that you need to consider a dialogue very closely with your local authority having jurisdiction over what are the requirements and how do the first responders, what do they recommend, as well as your local education agency and all of the staff that are going to operate the facility, as well as the staff that are going to maintain that facility. I see a question, what do you recommend we call places that are not storm shelters or safe rooms? We have spaces internal to the building, away from outside walls, windows, and doors, that we think would provide greater safety. What should we call them so people are not misled? This is a great question, and I wish there was an industry standard answer for that question. I will say that I have seen people say I've seen people say a storm weather assembly area, but even that terminology could be misunderstood. So what I would suggest is that you talk with your local design professionals, architects and engineers, and begin a dialogue with them. And really you could make that dovetailed into your conversation in general of where are the appropriate spaces. Another question I see is using the logic of putting as many walls between you and the outside a good way to describe safer areas in a school or other building when selecting safe areas good to use? And it's very difficult to answer that question. For example, if I've got a concrete masonry wall that goes 8 inches above an acoustical ceiling, and all of that is below a roof structure that's well above all of that, well, a concrete masonry wall could fall down on someone if it's not designed for wind pressures. So the walls themselves can be hazards if you don't think about it like a structural engineer. And so it's very difficult for me to try to teach everyone who's ever going to hear this presentation all about structural engineering. But that's the question: is what is the load path, and what is resisting the wind forces? Where are the wind forces? And that's a complex thing. That's why I think it's appropriate, if you can, contact a local design professional that you work with and ask them for help in finding a qualified structural engineer and helping you determine what areas may be more appropriate than others. Okay, so I don't see any more questions, and so I'm going to go ahead and wrap it up. Thank you very much.
ACEF would like to extend a very special thank you to our presenter, Mr. Ben Harris, and our participants for joining our webinar today. We hope that you took this opportunity to learn from the content presented, engaged with the speaker, and will use this content to advance your professional knowledge on issues related to school safety during a tornado. Please take a moment to complete the webinar evaluation. We value your opinion and look forward to hearing your feedback. Remember to visit our website at acefacilities.org and follow us on your preferred social media outlet.